Hello, everybody, language lovers, language learning enthusiasts. Another language learning video today. That's what this channel is all about. And today's topic is, are children better at learning languages than adults? Let me jump to the conclusion. No. But let me tell you why. Because I've heard ever since I was a child, and I still hear this regularly, is people will say, oh, but children are so much better at learning languages than adults. And if you have studied linguistics or neurology or something like this, and you're familiar with the critical language or critical period hypothesis, I'm not going to talk about that in this video, so let's just set this aside. If you're curious about it, you can look it up. But I don't think it's entirely relevant to this conversation, so I'm not going to discuss it here. What I want to talk about is when we say children are better at learning languages than adults, why do we say that? And some people will point and they say, well, my son or my son's friends or whatever, they came from this country, they moved to this other country, and then within a year, the parents were still, they could barely speak a word in the language, and the kids could speak just like they were one of the locals. You've probably heard a story like this, or maybe you've experienced something like this firsthand. And then it leads us to the conclusion that children are better at learning foreign languages. But is that really true? Now I want you to first, let's take a step back and let us ask ourselves a few questions. The first one is, who would you think would be better at learning a new sport, a child or an adult? Who do you think would be better at learning a new instrument, musical instrument, a child or an adult? Who do you think would be better at learning a new form of dance, a child or an adult? And then we see that you probably had an intuition, well, a child would be better at it because maybe you think they're not so set in their habits. Or maybe you think, well, because they're not so stressed. They don't have so many responsibilities. Children have more time. They have more enthusiasm. They have energy. I don't have any energy to learn something new. At the end of the day, I just want to sit down and watch TV. So when you think about it like this, you might think, well, are children better at learning anything? Is it really that children are better at learning languages? Or they're just better at learning everything than adults? You might say, wait a second. That's not true, because I know that if I had to sit down a 5-year-old and have them learn, I don't know, something really difficult like quantum mechanics or molecular biology or I don't know, this type of really difficult, trigonometry, something, I don't know, a difficult topic, then you might think, well, maybe me as an adult, assuming that you're a somewhat educated adult, you went to school or maybe you studied in university and took all these subjects, so at least you have some kind of, you're not learning this from scratch. You might be like, well, wait a second, if it was between me and a 5-year-old, I think maybe I could learn in a year, maybe I would have a better level of mastery in this topic than a child. And I think that's certainly true. That experience and knowledge accumulated through one's lifetime does grant one an advantage. So why should this not hold true when it comes to language learning? And I would say it does hold true with language learning. If you're an adult, you can learn a language faster than a child. But you probably won't because of all the other reasons that we kind of alluded to. Because let's look at first the example of someone who, like the story I said, the family moved to a new country. After 1 year, mom and dad still could barely speak a word in the language, whereas the child was speaking fluently, just like a local. Now, first of all, if you hear this kind of story, you should have a little bit of, take it with a grain of salt, because if the parents weren't fluent in the language, how did they really know their children were fluent in the language other than, that it seemed like it? So So things can be deceiving, looks can be deceiving, as we say. So maybe it seemed like the child was just as fluent as the locals, but maybe they actually could just get by, and the level of their language proficiency compared to local was actually quite significant. But these children who came from another country could just speak well enough, and they didn't have this kind of self-conscious attitude. They would just speak the language and feel comfortable and confident speaking it, even though they weren't necessarily that good at it, at least in this kind of comparative terms. The other thing is, let's look at the lifestyle of the child and the parent in this example. Well, they probably took the child and sent them to some kind of school where they spoke the local language there. Whereas mom and dad were probably working in an office or maybe staying at home where nobody spoke the local language. So after a year, who do you expect to be better at a language? Someone who was in an environment where everybody else was speaking the foreign language and they were required to use this to communicate with all of their peers all day, every day? Or these people who were not in that environment at all, who were maybe in an office where the working language was English, and so everyone just had to speak English, even though the colleagues were maybe locals or from different countries, everyone just spoke English because that's the working language. And so they never actually, from 9 to 5, they were in an environment where they couldn't use the foreign language, they didn't hear it at all. And then they come home, and maybe the child is playing with other friends where they can use the language, they're watching cartoons in the language, and then mom and dad are going to the store and making dinner, and then they relax, and they read a newspaper. But do they read a newspaper in the local language, or do they read it in something after a long day of work that they're comfortable? Are they going to go and sit at the desk and study a foreign language for a couple hours? And even if they did study a couple hours at that point, does it match the child who maybe spent 6 to 8 hours at school in an environment where the language was being used constantly and they were expected to communicate with other peers in this language? Now, of course, we'd expect the child to be better with this circumstantial difference. Of course we would. The circumstances are so different that no one would expect at the end of this time the adult to be better. Even if they did have some level of dedication to it at the end of the day, in the evening, they're sitting down with their language study books or getting their lessons on Skype or whatever it is. And then also this is an accumulated effect. After a couple of years, maybe the child has now been living in the country, new country for a couple of years, and they've been interacting with all their peers for 3 years in this language, where the adult has been trying to eke out whatever time they can at the end of their day to have some language practice. Of course the child will be better than an adult. And I think the other thing is that, well, what if we switched the child and the adult? What if the adult had to go to school and had a bunch of peers and they were constantly surrounded by the language, and you weren't allowed to use your native language anymore because nobody understands it, nobody's using it, so you have to speak to, let's say, this American family immigrates to Spain, just so we can use some concrete language here. So you have to, so the adult has to go and spend all day in school and speak with everyone in Spanish, and no one speaks English, they won't even understand English if you try, so you have to speak Spanish, and then if you want to express something, like get people to understand you, you have to speak Spanish now. Whereas the child is in some environment where everyone only speaks English all day. Now after 1 year, who do you expect to be better, the child or the adult? Well, I think we would say the adult. So is it that children are better at languages than adults, or is it just the circumstances for children tend to be more conducive to language learning in this scenario? Now, also in this scenario, we also have to look at when people communicate with children, they have much more patience and much more compassion in general, and you're often dealing with much more concrete things. Adults like to talk about things which are abstract and they can't be necessarily seen or touched. Like if an adult is talking about politics or economics or this kind of daily, these kind of topics, it's very different from a child who's going to school and they're like, this is a block, and this is a triangle, and you put these together like this, and it looks like a house. So, of course, if you're in this kind of environment now, this is a much more, this is an environment, the way that people are communicating with you, the things they're talking about, it's going to be much easier to understand the language in context and learn new words and pick up the grammar kind of without having to study it explicitly. So, if you've ever had the experience of, if you can see a child, a newborn child, and when the parents are first speaking to them, in the first year or two of life, an adult, the mother or father of a child, when they're speaking to the child, they spend a lot of attention trying to be like, oh, this is a ball. This is a ball. Look at the ball. Oh, the ball's rolling. This is a blue ball. Oh, it's a little ball. Oh, this one's a big ball. Now, if someone spoke like this to you all day, every day for a couple of years, you'd also probably be pretty good at a language, wouldn't you? So we have to understand when we say that children are better at learning languages than adults, it's not an apples to apples comparison. Apples to apples comparison would be like, we have a child and an adult, and they both go to the same foreign language learning class that they take in the evening at a long day when they're both tired, and they study for 1 hour a day, and that's the only exposure they get to a language. In this scenario, who do you think is going to be a better language learner, the child or the adult? Well, who do you think is going to have an easier time understanding concepts or grammatic terminology that has to relate with grammar? If I say, this is accusative, this is nominative, and this is dative, these verbs are transitive, these are intransitive, this is past, this is pluperfect, and so on and so forth, who is going to struggle more with this terminology? Now, a child or an adult? Well, maybe both of them will struggle with this terminology if they're not super comfortable with languages or with linguistics, but I would still bet on the adult because they can kind of they can think about it more rationally. Maybe these long words don't seem so scary to them, and so on. So, and again, like, I would just say, people also say, well, children, they're not afraid to make mistakes, but adults are afraid to make mistakes, and that's why adults are worse at learning foreign languages. I would say, well, that's also not true. I feel like if you take a good look at children and you take a good look at adults, then you can see that, well, there's a lot of variation between individuals. Some children are very self-conscious. How often have you seen someone, they said, oh, look, hey, it's your teacher. We saw her at the, say hi. And the child, oh, come on, say, oh, he normally talks more, but say hi to this person. The child says nothing. Oh, well, normally he's such a chatterbox at home. He's just shy. Have you heard people say this? Like everywhere you go, there's always someone saying this, right? So some children are very self-conscious, and they're not just going to just speak because they're supposed to, or you'd like them to, or you ask them to. And the same is true of adults. Not all adults are self-conscious. Some of them just have no qualms about making a fool of themselves, or they don't think that they're making a fool of themselves by making a mistake when they speak a foreign language. So, in conclusion, I would say that, are children better at learning languages than adults? No. We both have the same capacity to learn languages. I think as adults, we have an advantage because of our accumulated knowledge. The advantage that children have isn't necessarily anything to do with their physiology or their personality. Like, children in general don't have a personality. Every child has their own personality, and the same is true of adults. So I don't think it's anything about being a child that makes you better at learning a foreign language, or being an adult that makes you worse. Circumstantially, situationally, we're in different places that lend themselves better or worse to learning a foreign language. And when we say that children are better at learning foreign languages, I think We're never making these apples to apples comparisons. And I think I would like to, the take-home message of this discussion to be, if you can imagine as an adult learner being put in the place of a child, like put in this place where all of your peers are speaking the foreign language, adults are kind of mentoring you and trying to help you and saying things to you again and again and getting you to understand, and you're doing this every day for hours and hours because you don't have to be at work all day and then you don't have all these extra responsibilities. If you can imagine yourself as an adult in that situation, you might think, well, yeah, then it would be easier for me to learn a foreign language. And I think it would. And there's nothing about being an adult that your brain is broken or your capacity to learn a foreign language is shut off because you've reached a particular age. It's just we think that, we think that we should be able to learn a language really quickly as adults, when actually, we often spend only 30 minutes or even an hour a day. If you could do that every day, you're probably studying more than most people are, more than most other adults are studying their foreign language. So it's really very, very little time that adults end up spending on foreign language compared to children who maybe have to learn a foreign language. So that's all I'd like to say to that. To reiterate, children are not any better at learning foreign languages. They just tend to be in advantageous situations or circumstances that are more conducive to learning foreign languages.